bear cub was surrounded by lava flows from an erupting volcano. What this baby did was shocking. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The morning air in Cascade Ridge carried an unusual warmth that made 3-year-old Willow Chen fidget in her high chair. Her mother, Grace, was busy packing emergency supplies into duffel bags while casting worried glances toward the kitchen window. The mountain that had loomed peacefully over their small town for generations now wore a crown of angry gray smoke. "Mama, why is the sky dirty?" Willow asked, pointing her chubby finger at the ash-streaked horizon. Her innocent question hung in the air as Grace paused, unsure how to explain to her toddler that Mount Sentinel had awakened after 60 years of slumber. Outside, the Chen family's neighbor, elderly Mr. Russo, was loading his truck with whatever belongings he could carry. The evacuation order hadn't been issued yet, but everyone in Cascade Ridge knew the signs. The tremors that had started 3 days ago were getting stronger. The sulfur smell was getting thicker, and now thin streams of orange light were visible through the tree line. Grace lifted Willow from her chair and carried her to the window. "See that mountain, sweetie? It's having a bad day. We might need to go visit Grandma for a while." What Grace didn't know was that 6 miles up the mountain, a small bear cub named Coda had wandered too far from his mother's den. The curious little bear had been following the strange warm scents drifting through the forest. His nose twitched with interest as he climbed over fallen logs and pushed through thick undergrowth, drawn by something he couldn't understand. Coda's mother, Sage, had left him sleeping while she foraged for late berries. She'd told him to stay put, but the 8-month-old cub had never been good at following instructions. When he woke to find strange orange glows dancing between the trees, his curiosity got the better of him. Back in the Chen household, Willow pressed her nose against the cool window glass. Something was moving in the distant tree line. Something small and dark against the growing orange backdrop. She couldn't make out what it was, but her 3-year-old mind found it fascinating. "Mama, puppy!" she exclaimed, pointing toward the mountain. Grace looked where her daughter was pointing, but saw only the ominous glow growing brighter by the hour. "I don't see any puppy, honey. Maybe it's just shadows from the trees." But Willow kept watching. She had always been drawn to animals. Even at her young age, she seemed to understand them in a way that amazed her parents. She would sit perfectly still when squirrels came near, and birds often landed close to her in the yard, as if sensing her gentle nature. The ground beneath their house gave another rumble, stronger this time. Picture frames rattled on the walls, and Grace's coffee mug slid across the kitchen counter. This tremor made Grace's decision for her. "David," she called to her husband, who was in the garage gathering camping gear. "We need to leave, now." David Chen emerged from the garage, his face grim. "The radio says they're about to issue a mandatory evacuation. Highway 9 is already backed up with people heading south." As the family scrambled to load their car, Willow kept her eyes fixed on the mountain. The small, dark shape she'd spotted was moving, but not toward safety. It seemed to be heading deeper into the glowing forest. Miles away, Coda had discovered his mistake too late. What had looked like interesting warm rocks from a distance were actually rivers of molten lava flowing between the trees. The little cub found himself on a small rocky outcrop, surrounded on 3 sides by the approaching lava flows. The heat made his fur prickle, and the sulfur smell burned his sensitive nose. He called out for his mother with high-pitched yelps that echoed off the surrounding rocks. But Sage was too far away, frantically searching for her missing cub in a completely different part of the forest. She could smell the danger in the air and hear the mountain's rumbling anger, but she had no idea where Coda had wandered. The lava moved slowly but relentlessly, like honey made of fire. Trees caught flames as the molten rock touched their roots. The forest that had been Coda's playground was becoming his prison. In Cascade Ridge, the Chen family's car was packed and ready. David started the engine while Grace did a final check of the house. Willow sat in her car seat, still staring up at the mountain through the rear window. "We go help Puppy?" she asked, as her father began backing out of the driveway. "What puppy, sweetie?" Grace asked, turning to check on her daughter. Willow's small hand pressed against the window. Her eyes, usually bright with toddler mischief, were serious in a way that made Grace's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. "Puppy's scared," Willow whispered. And somehow, impossibly, Grace found herself believing that her daughter really could see something the rest of them couldn't. The evacuation convoy moved like a slow-moving river of red taillights down Highway 9. David drummed his fingers nervously on the steering wheel as their car crawled forward at barely 10 miles per hour. Other families had the same idea, and now hundreds of vehicles were packed bumper to bumper, trying to escape the mountain's growing fury. "This is taking too long," David muttered, checking his rearview mirror. The orange glow behind them was definitely getting brighter. Ash was starting to fall like gray snow, coating their windshield in a fine layer that the wipers could barely clear. Grace turned to check on Willow, expecting to find her daughter getting fussy from being stuck in the car. Instead, she found the 3-year-old sitting perfectly still, her small hands pressed flat against the side window. Willow's eyes were wide and unblinking, fixed on something in the distance that only she could see. "Willow? Baby, what is it?" Grace asked softly. "Puppy crying," Willow whispered. Her voice had a strange quality to it, almost like she was in a trance. "Puppy can't find Mama." A chill ran down Grace's spine despite the warm air. Her daughter had never spoken like this before. There was something different about the way Willow was acting, something that made Grace's maternal instincts scream that something was very wrong. Behind them, a new sound joined the rumbling of the mountain. Emergency sirens wailed as fire trucks and rescue vehicles tried to weave between the stalled traffic. The radio crackled with urgent updates about road closures and evacuation centers. David reached over and squeezed Grace's hand. "She's probably just overwhelmed by all this chaos. Kids pick up on stress," but Grace wasn't convinced. She'd been a mother long enough to know the difference between a scared child and something else entirely. Willow wasn't frightened. She was focused, as if she was receiving some kind of signal that no one else could hear. Meanwhile, high on the mountain, Coda's situation was becoming desperate. The lava had advanced on 2 more sides, leaving him trapped on an increasingly small piece of solid ground. The little cub's paws were getting hot from the heated rock beneath him, and the air shimmered with heat waves that made it hard to breathe. He had stopped calling for his mother. His throat was raw, and he was beginning to understand that she couldn't hear him over the mountain's roar. Instead, he crouched low, instinctively trying to make himself as small as possible. The strange thing was, Coda could sense something else in his mind. It felt like a gentle touch, like the way his mother would nuzzle him when he was scared during thunderstorms. But this feeling was coming from somewhere far away, from down in the valley where the small lights of the human settlement flickered. Sage, Coda's mother, had picked up his scent trail an hour ago. Now she was racing through the forest, following the path her cub had taken. But with each step the trail grew fainter, masked by the overwhelming smell of sulfur and smoke. Her powerful legs carried her over fallen trees and around boulders, but she was running out of time. She could see the glow ahead through the trees. Her maternal instincts told her that her cub was somewhere in that direction. but the heat radiating from the lava flows made it impossible to get closer. Every time she tried to approach, the intensity forced her back. For the first time in her life, the powerful bear felt helpless. Back on the highway, the traffic had come to a complete stop. A fallen tree across the road ahead was blocking all lanes, and emergency crews were working to clear it. David turned off the engine to save gas, and the family sat in the growing darkness as ash continued to fall. "How long do you think we'll be stuck here?" Grace asked, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. Before David could answer, Willow suddenly perked up. She unbuckled herself from her car seat with surprising coordination for a 3-year-old and climbed into the front seat between her parents. "We have to go back," she said simply. "What?" Grace caught her daughter before she could climb further forward. "Honey, we can't go back. It's not safe." "Puppy needs help," Willow insisted. Her small hands gripped Grace's shirt with unusual strength. "Puppy all alone, fire everywhere." David exchanged a concerned look with his wife. "Willow, sweetheart, there are no puppies on the mountain. It's just us people and we all need to leave." But Willow shook her head vigorously. "Not puppy. Baby bear. Baby bear stuck." The words hung in the air like a revelation. Grace felt her breath catch in her throat. How could her 3-year-old daughter possibly know about a bear cub on the mountain? They lived in bear country, but they rarely saw them, especially not cubs. "Willow," Grace said carefully, "how do you know about a baby bear?" The little girl looked at her mother with those serious eyes again. "He talks to me, in here." She patted her chest, right over her heart. "He's scared. Fire getting closer." A medical explanation flashed through Grace's mind. Maybe the stress of the evacuation was causing Willow to have some kind of episode. Or perhaps she'd seen something on television that was mixing with her imagination. But deep down, in a place that logic couldn't reach, Grace felt like her daughter was telling the truth. The radio crackled again with an update. "This is Emergency Management Services. We are receiving reports of wildlife displaced by the volcanic activity. Several bears have been spotted moving through residential areas as they flee the mountain. Residents are advised to remain in their vehicles and report any sightings immediately." David and Grace looked at each other with growing alarm. If bears were already fleeing the mountain, that meant the danger was spreading faster than anyone had predicted. "Mama," Willow tugged on Grace's sleeve. "We have to help him. He's just a baby like me." Before Grace could respond, a new sound cut through the night. It was different from the mountain's rumbling or the sirens. It was a low, mournful cry that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Other people in nearby cars had heard it too. Doors began opening as people stepped out to look around. The sound came again, longer this time, filled with a desperation that made everyone's skin crawl. "That's a bear," said a man from the car next to them. "That's definitely a bear calling." Willow's eyes filled with tears. "That's Mama Bear. She looking for baby." And in that moment, Grace realized that her daughter wasn't confused or having an episode. Somehow, impossibly, Willow was connected to what was happening on the mountain in a way that defied all explanation. The question was, what were they supposed to do about it? The sound of the mother bear's desperate call echoed through the valley again, and this time it was answered by another sound from much higher up the mountain. A smaller, weaker cry that barely carried over the noise of the evacuation. Willow gasped and pressed both hands to her chest. "He answered! Baby Bear answered his mama." Grace felt a strange, tingling sensation spread through her body. She'd always considered herself a practical person, someone who believed in science and logic. But watching her daughter's reaction to sounds that seemed to affect her in ways that went beyond normal hearing was shaking everything she thought she knew about the world. "David," she said quietly, "what if she's right?" Her husband was checking his phone, trying to get an update on when the road would be cleared. "Right about what?" "What if there really is a bear cub up there? What if somehow Willow can sense it?" David looked at his wife like she'd suggested they all sprout wings and fly. "Grace, come on. I know this situation is stressful, but we can't start believing in—" He was interrupted by a commotion from the cars ahead of them. People were getting out, pointing toward the mountain and talking excitedly. David rolled down his window to hear what was happening. A woman in a park ranger uniform was walking between the cars with a megaphone. "Attention everyone, we've just received reports from our helicopter unit. There appears to be a bear cub trapped by lava flows approximately 6 miles up on the north face. The mother bear has been spotted trying to reach the cub but can't get through. We're asking everyone to remain calm and stay with your vehicles while we assess the situation." Grace felt like the world had shifted beneath her feet. She looked at Willow, who was nodding slowly as if this news was exactly what she'd been expecting. "I told you," Willow said simply. "Baby bear needs help." David's mouth fell open. He stared at his daughter, then at his wife, then back at Willow. How could you possibly have known that? But before Willow could answer, another voice joined the conversation. It was coming from the car behind them, where an elderly Native American woman had gotten out and was approaching their vehicle. "Excuse me," the woman said, her weathered face kind but serious. "I couldn't help but overhear. Your little one has the gift, doesn't she?" Grace rolled down her window, feeling like she was stepping into a dream. "I'm sorry. What gift?" The woman smiled softly. "My grandmother would have called it speaking with the spirit of the land. Some children are born with the ability to connect with animals, especially when they're in distress. It usually fades as they get older, but while they have it—" She looked at Willow with something like reverence. "It's very real." "That's impossible," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" the woman asked. "Your daughter knew about the bear cub before anyone else did. She felt its fear, its need for help. That's not impossible, young man. That's sacred." Willow had been listening to this conversation with the intense focus that only small children could manage. Now she tugged on Grace's sleeve again. "The baby bear is getting more scared," she said urgently. "The hot rock is getting closer. His paws hurt." As if to confirm her words, the mountain gave another rumble, and they could see new streams of orange light appearing between the trees. The lava flows were advancing faster than anyone had predicted. The park ranger with the megaphone was back, and her voice carried a new tension. "We need to speed up this evacuation. The volcanic activity is increasing more rapidly than expected. Emergency crews are working to clear the road, but we need everyone to be ready to move as soon as possible." Grace made a decision that surprised even herself. She got out of the car. "Grace, what are you doing?" David called after her. But Grace was already walking toward the park ranger. Behind her, she could hear David quickly rolling up the windows and locking the car before hurrying to catch up. "Excuse me," Grace said when she reached the ranger. "My daughter. She's been saying things about the bear cub before anyone knew it was there." The ranger, whose name tag read Maria Santos, looked at Grace with tired eyes. "Ma'am, we appreciate everyone's concern, but we have professionals handling this situation." "But what if she could help somehow?" Grace pressed. "What if she really can communicate with the bear?" Ranger Santos was about to give a polite but firm dismissal when another voice joined them. It was the elderly native woman who had spoken to Grace earlier. "Maria," the woman said, and Grace was surprised by the familiar tone. "This child has the connection. You know that such things exist." Ranger Santos's expression changed when she saw who was speaking. "Mrs. Clearwater, what are you doing here?" "Evacuating like everyone else, granddaughter. But this is important. The child can help." Grace suddenly understood. Mrs. Clearwater wasn't just any elderly woman. She was connected to the ranger, and clearly someone whose opinion carried weight. "Grandmother," Ranger Santos said softly, "we have protocols for animal rescue situations. We can't involve civilians, especially not a child." "And how are those protocols working so far?" Mrs. Clearwater asked pointedly. "Can your helicopters land safely in the lava field? Can your teams get close enough to help without being overcome by the heat and toxic gases?" Ranger Santos fell silent. The truth was, they'd already determined that a direct rescue was impossible. The area around the trapped cub was too dangerous for any conventional approach. Meanwhile, back at their car, Willow was pressed against the window, tears streaming down her face. David had stayed with her, but he could see his daughter's distress growing by the minute. "Daddy," she whispered, "Baby Bear is calling for help louder now. His mama is trying to come, but the fire won't let her." David felt something crack inside his chest. Looking at his daughter's genuine anguish, he couldn't deny what was happening anymore. Somehow, his 3-year-old was connected to a situation happening miles away. Up on the mountain, Coda was indeed crying louder now. The lava had advanced to within 10 feet of his rocky perch, and the heat was becoming unbearable. His small paws were dancing on the hot stone, and his thick fur was no protection against the radiating temperature. But something strange was happening to him. In his terror, he felt a presence in his mind. It wasn't his mother's presence, which he would recognize instantly. This was something smaller, gentler, and somehow familiar. It felt like safety and comfort, like the warm feeling he got when his mother groomed him after a feeding. The presence seemed to be trying to tell him something, to wait, to be brave. That help was coming, even though he couldn't see how that was possible. Sage had reached the outer edge of the lava field. She could see her cub in the distance, a small dark shape on a rock that was getting smaller by the minute. Her powerful body quivered with the need to charge forward and save him, but every step closer brought unbearable heat that singed her fur and burned her paw pads. She roared her frustration and despair into the night sky. It was a sound that spoke of every mother's worst nightmare, being unable to protect her child. Back at the evacuation site, Ranger Santos was getting updates over her radio that made her frown deepen. "The situation is deteriorating rapidly," she told the small group that had gathered around her. "We've got maybe an hour before that whole section of forest is consumed." Mrs. Clearwater looked at Grace meaningfully. "Your daughter. Bring her here." Grace hesitated. "I don't want to put her in danger or make this harder for her emotionally." "Child," Mrs. Clearwater said gently. "She's already connected to this situation. Keeping her away won't protect her from feeling what's happening, but allowing her to help might give everyone a chance." Before Grace could respond, David appeared with Willow in his arms. The little girl's eyes were red from crying, but when she saw the group of adults, she straightened up with a determination that seemed far older than her years. "I can help Baby Bear," she said clearly, "but we have to hurry. The fire is almost touching him." Ranger Santos knelt down to Willow's eye level. "Sweetheart, what exactly do you think you can do?" Willow tilted her head to one side, as if listening to something only she could hear. "Baby Bear needs to know which way to jump. There's a safe path, but he can't see it because of all the fire and smoke. His mama can't tell him because she's too far away." "And you can tell him?" Ranger Santos asked, her skepticism warring with desperation. "I don't tell him with words," Willow explained patiently. "I show him with feelings, like when Mama shows me it's safe to cross the street by holding my hand tight." Mrs. Clearwater nodded approvingly. The ancestors would have understood this perfectly. The child sees with her heart, not her eyes. Ranger Santos was quiet for a long moment, looking at the small girl who spoke with such certainty about impossible things. Finally, she spoke into her radio. "Command, this is Santos. I need to speak with the incident commander about a potential solution to the bear cub situation. It's unconventional." As she waited for a response, they all heard Sage's anguished roar echoing through the valley again. This time, it was answered not just by her cub's weak cry, but by something else. Something that made every person in the evacuation convoy stop what they were doing and listen in amazement. The sound was unlike anything they'd ever heard before. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't animal either. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, rising and falling like a song without words. It carried on the wind with an ethereal quality that made the hair on everyone's arms stand up. David grabbed Grace's hand instinctively. "What is that?" Mrs. Clearwater closed her eyes and smiled peacefully. "That's the sound of the mountain itself. The old ones say that when tragedy is about to strike, the land itself calls out for harmony. It's asking for balance to be restored." Ranger Santos was getting excited chatter over her radio. "Santos, are you hearing this? Our seismic equipment is picking up unusual acoustic patterns. It's like the mountain is resonating at a specific frequency. We've never recorded anything like it." But Willow was having a very different reaction to the mysterious sound. She suddenly went rigid in her father's arms, her eyes wide and unseeing. Her small body began to tremble, not with fear, but with something that looked almost like recognition. "Willow?" Grace reached for her daughter, alarmed. "Baby, what's happening?" The 3-year-old's voice, when she spoke, sounded older somehow, wiser. "The mountain is sad. It didn't want to hurt anyone. The fire inside has been sleeping for so long, but something woke it up, something that didn't belong." A chill ran down Grace's spine. Her daughter was talking about the volcano like it was a living thing with feelings and intentions. This went beyond just sensing animals in distress. Mrs. Clearwater moved closer, her weathered hand gently touching Willow's forehead. "What woke the fire, little one?" "Men came," Willow said, her voice still carrying that strange, distant quality. "They put metal things deep in the ground. They disturbed the sleeping fire. Now it has to find a new place to rest, but it doesn't know where to go." Ranger Santos felt the blood drain from her face. 3 months ago, a mining company had been conducting exploratory drilling on the mountain, looking for rare earth minerals. The state had shut down the operation after environmental concerns were raised, but the damage to the underground structure might already have been done. "My God," she whispered. The geological surveys did show some unusual instability near the old drilling sites. But there was no time to process this revelation fully, because the mysterious sound was growing stronger, and Willow was responding to it in an increasingly alarming way. Her small body was now shaking so violently that David was struggling to hold her. "She's having some kind of seizure," Grace said frantically. "We need to get her to a hospital." "No," Mrs. Clearwater said firmly. "This isn't a medical emergency. She's becoming a conduit. The mountain is trying to speak through her." "That's impossible," David protested, even as he held his trembling daughter closer. "Is it?" Mrs. Clearwater asked. Your child already spoke to a bear cub 6 miles away. Is communicating with the land itself really so much more impossible? Up on the mountain, Coda was experiencing something extraordinary. The strange sound that filled the air seemed to be coming from the rock beneath his paws. He could feel it vibrating through his small body, and somehow it was bringing him comfort. The fear that had been overwhelming him was slowly being replaced by a calm certainty. More importantly, the sound seemed to be doing something to the lava around him. The molten rock that had been advancing steadily was starting to slow. In some places it appeared to be changing direction slightly, as if being guided by an invisible hand. Sage noticed the change too. The heat that had been driving her back was lessening, just enough that she could take a few steps closer to her cub. She didn't understand what was happening, but her maternal instincts told her to be ready. Something was about to change. Back at the evacuation site, Willow suddenly stopped shaking. She opened her eyes and looked directly at Ranger Santos with an intensity that made the adult woman take a step back. "You have to let me help now," Willow said, and her voice was completely her own again. "The mountain showed me what to do, but we have to go higher up, to where we can see." "Absolutely not," David said immediately. "We're not taking you closer to danger." "But Daddy," Willow said patiently, "I'm already connected to the danger. Distance doesn't matter. But if I can see the baby bear with my real eyes, I can help him better." Ranger Santos was torn between protocol and the increasingly desperate situation. Her radio crackled with updates that weren't encouraging. The main lava flow was accelerating, and they were running out of time. "There's an observation post about 2 miles up," she said slowly. "It's still well within the safe zone, but it has a clear view of the north face. We use it for wildlife monitoring." "Maria," Mrs. Clearwater said quietly, "sometimes the traditional ways are the only ways that work." Grace looked at her husband, seeing her own conflicted feelings reflected in his eyes. Everything rational told them to get their daughter as far away from the mountain as possible. But everything they'd witnessed in the past hour told them that Willow might be the key to saving not just one baby bear, but potentially many lives. "If we do this," Grace said finally, "you come with us, and at the first sign of real danger, we leave immediately." Ranger Santos nodded. "I'll radio for a vehicle that can take us up the service road, but I want it on record that this is against all safety protocols." As they waited for transportation, Willow wandered a few steps away from the adults, drawn by something only she could sense. She stopped at the edge of the evacuation area, where the forest began, and placed her small hand on the trunk of a large pine tree. The tree was old, probably over 100 years, and its bark was warm to the touch despite the cool night air. As soon as Willow's palm made contact with the rough surface, her eyes widened in wonder. She could feel the tree's deep roots extending down into the earth, connecting with other trees, forming a vast underground network that stretched across the entire mountain. And through that network, she could sense every living thing in the forest. The deer fleeing toward lower ground, the birds that had already taken flight, the smaller animals huddled in their burrows, but most importantly, she could feel Coda, still trapped on his rocky island, surrounded by the slowly advancing lava. "I can see him," she whispered, and the adults turned to see her standing motionless against the tree, her face glowing with a soft, inner light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Willow?" Grace approached carefully, not wanting to break whatever connection her daughter had established. "He's not alone anymore," Willow said softly. "The trees are talking to him. They're telling him which way to go. But he's scared to jump. He needs to feel brave." Mrs. Clearwater moved to Willow's other side and placed her own hand on the tree trunk. For a moment her expression became distant, as if she too was listening to something beyond normal hearing. "The child speaks truth," she said after a moment. "The forest is trying to save its own, but the little one needs more than directions. He needs courage." "How do we give a bear cub courage?" David asked, feeling like he'd stepped into a world where normal rules no longer applied. "The same way you give any child courage," Mrs. Clearwater replied, "with love, with the absolute certainty that someone cares about them and believes they can be brave." A rumbling sound drew their attention back to the road, where a Park Service vehicle was approaching. Ranger Santos waved it down, and a young ranger jumped out from behind the wheel. "Santos, are you sure about this?" the young man asked. "The whole north face is becoming unstable. We've had 3 seismic events in the past 10 minutes. "I'm not sure about anything, Martinez," Ranger Santos replied, "but conventional rescue methods have failed, and we're running out of time. Sometimes you have to try something different." As they climbed into the vehicle, Willow took one last look at the tree she'd been touching. For just a moment she could have sworn she saw a faint green glow running up and down its trunk, like energy flowing through its veins. "Thank you," she whispered to the tree, and she could have sworn she felt it whisper back. The drive up the mountain was unlike anything Grace had ever experienced. The service road was narrow and winding, cut into the hillside with steep drops on one side and rocky walls on the other. But it wasn't the physical danger that made her grip David's hand so tightly. It was watching her 3-year-old daughter stare out the window with an expression of deep concentration, occasionally pointing in directions that seemed random, but which she somehow knew were significant. "Baby Bear is getting tired," Willow reported as they climbed higher. "The hot rock is very close now. His paws hurt from the heat." "How much farther to the observation post?" David asked Ranger Santos. "About half a mile," she replied, but her radio was crackling with increasingly urgent updates. "Command, this is Santos. What's the current status on the lava advancement?" "Santos, the flow rate has increased significantly in the past 15 minutes. At current speed, the Cub's position will be overrun in approximately 30 minutes. We're recommending immediate evacuation of all personnel from the North Face monitoring stations." Willow turned from the window to look at the adults with tears in her eyes. "We're almost out of time," she said simply. And as if the mountain itself had heard her words, it responded with a tremor that shook the vehicle and sent rocks tumbling down the hillside around them. Something was about to happen, something that would change everything. But first, they had to get to where Willow could do whatever it was she needed to do. Because despite all logic and reason, everyone in that vehicle now believed that this small child held the key to saving not just one baby bear, but possibly many more lives than they could imagine. The observation post appeared around the next bend, a small wooden structure perched on a rocky outcrop with a clear view of the northern slope. As soon as they arrived, Willow was out of the vehicle before anyone could stop her, running toward the edge of the platform. "Willow, wait!" Grace called. But her daughter had already reached the railing and was pointing excitedly into the distance. "I can see him! I can see Baby Bear!" And indeed, through the smoke and the orange glow of the lava flows, they could just make out a small dark shape on what appeared to be an increasingly tiny island of solid rock, surrounded by the relentless advance of molten stone. What happened next would defy explanation and challenge everything they thought they knew about the world. But it would also save a life, and in doing so, reveal a connection between all living things that most people spent their entire lives never discovering. Willow gripped the wooden railing of the observation platform, her knuckles white with concentration. From this vantage point, they could see the full scope of the volcanic destruction. Rivers of orange and red lava snaked down the mountainside like glowing serpents, consuming everything in their path. Trees exploded into flames as the molten rock reached them, sending sparks high into the ash-filled sky. And there, on a small rocky outcrop that seemed impossibly far away, was Coda. Even through binoculars, the bear cub appeared tiny and vulnerable, a small dark speck surrounded by an ocean of fire. Ranger Santos adjusted the focus on her field glasses and handed them to Grace. "My God," Grace whispered as she peered through the lenses. "He's so small. How has he survived this long?" "Baby Bear is very brave," Willow said matter-of-factly. "But he's getting scared again. The fire is making noises that hurt his ears." As if to demonstrate her point, a loud crack echoed across the valley as a massive tree finally succumbed to the heat and crashed to the ground in a shower of sparks. The sound made everyone on the platform flinch, but Willow simply closed her eyes and placed her hands flat against the wooden railing. "Don't be scared, Baby Bear," she whispered. "I'm here now." David felt a strange sensation wash over him as he watched his daughter. The air around her seemed to shimmer slightly, like heat waves, but the night was cool at their elevation. And there was something else. Something that made his skin tingle with an energy he couldn't identify. Mrs. Clearwater had been silently observing everything, her weathered face serene despite the chaos around them. Now she moved to stand beside Willow, placing her own hands on the railing next to the child's. "The connection is strong," she said quietly. "Stronger than I've ever seen. This child is not just speaking to one bear cub. She's becoming part of the entire mountain's consciousness." Ranger Santos's radio crackled with an update that made her stomach drop. "Santos, we've got a problem. The main lava tube has shifted direction. It's now flowing directly toward the town of Pine Creek. We're looking at potential evacuation of another 3,000 residents." Pine Creek was only 2 miles from Cascade Ridge. If the lava reached there, it would be a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. But as Ranger Santos tried to process this new horror, something impossible began to happen. The mysterious sound they'd heard earlier was returning, but this time it was much stronger. It seemed to emanate from the very rock beneath their feet, vibrating up through the observation platform and filling the air around them with harmonics that defied explanation. And Willow was responding to it. The 3-year-old began to sway gently, her eyes still closed, her small hands pressed against the railing. As the sound grew stronger, a golden light began to appear around her fingers where they touched the wood. "Grace," David said urgently, reaching for his daughter. "Something's happening to her." But Mrs. Clearwater gently caught his wrist. "Don't interrupt her now. She's found the frequency." "The what?" "Every living thing vibrates at its own frequency," Mrs. Clearwater explained, her voice hushed with awe. "The trees, the animals, the rocks themselves. Your daughter has somehow tuned into the mountain's frequency and is using it to communicate with the bear cub." Up on his rocky perch, Coda was indeed experiencing something extraordinary. The sound that filled the air wasn't just reaching his ears anymore. It was resonating through every cell in his body. And within that sound he could hear something that filled him with hope, the voice of a friend. It wasn't words exactly, but feelings and images that appeared in his mind. The feeling of safety, the image of solid ground, and most importantly, the absolute certainty that he was not alone. The presence he'd sensed earlier was stronger now. It felt like being nuzzled by a mother, like being protected by a pack, like being loved unconditionally. For the first time since he'd become trapped, Coda felt brave enough to stand up and look around. That's when he saw it. a narrow bridge of cooled lava that hadn't been there before. It stretched from his rocky island to a larger stable area about 20 feet away. The bridge was barely 2 feet wide and steaming with residual heat, but it was solid. Meanwhile, Sage had managed to work her way closer to the lava field. The mysterious sound was affecting her too, calming her panic and sharpening her focus. She could see her cub more clearly now, and she could see the new path that had formed. But she also knew that Coda would need encouragement to attempt such a dangerous crossing. That's when she heard it, her cub calling out, not in fear, but with determination. And somehow, impossibly, his call was being answered by a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Back on the observation platform, Willow was no longer just standing at the railing. She was glowing. The golden light that had started at her fingertips was now surrounding her entire small body, pulsing gently in rhythm with the mysterious sound. Her parents watched in amazement and terror as their daughter became something more than human. "What's happening to her?" Grace whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She's becoming a bridge," Mrs. Clearwater replied. "A bridge between worlds, between species, between the physical and the spiritual. The mountain has chosen her as its voice." Ranger Santos was frantically trying to radio for help, but every attempt was met with static. The electromagnetic interference from whatever was happening around Willow was disrupting all electronic equipment. "We need to get her away from here," David said. But even as he spoke, he found himself unable to move. There was something about the scene that held him transfixed, something that spoke to a part of himself he'd never known existed. Willow's eyes suddenly opened, but they were no longer the brown eyes of a 3-year-old child. They were gold, like molten amber, and they held an ancient wisdom that made everyone who looked into them feel as though they were glimpsing the very soul of the earth itself. When she spoke, her voice carried 2 distinct tones: her own sweet child's voice, and something deeper, older, that seemed to echo from the mountain itself. "Baby bear," she said, and the words seemed to carry across the miles between the observation platform and the trapped cub. "You can do this. The path is safe. Trust in your paws, trust in your heart, and take the first step." Coda heard these words, not with his ears, but in his very bones. And with a courage that surprised even himself, the small bear cub stepped onto the narrow bridge of cooled lava. His first step was tentative, his paw testing the surface. The rock was warm but solid. He took another step, then another. The bridge was barely wide enough for his small body, and the heat from the active lava on either side made him pant heavily, but he kept going. With each step, Willow's glow grew brighter, and the sound from the mountain grew stronger. It was as if she was channeling all of her life force into guiding the cub to safety. "Come on, baby bear," she whispered, and now her voice was purely her own again, though it still carried that otherworldly resonance. "You're so brave. Your mama is waiting for you." And it was true. Sage had positioned herself at the end of the lava bridge, calling encouragement to her cub. For the first time in hours, she dared to hope that she would hold her baby again. But just as Coda reached the halfway point of his crossing, disaster struck. A new surge of lava burst from an underground fissure directly beneath the bridge. The narrow path began to buckle and crack, and sections of it started to crumble into the molten flow below. Coda froze, trapped in the middle of a bridge that was disintegrating beneath his paws. On the observation platform, Willow screamed, not with her voice, but with her entire being. The scream was picked up by every tree, every rock, every living thing on the mountain, creating a chorus of anguish that shook the very foundations of the earth. The golden light around her flared so brightly that everyone had to shield their eyes. And in that moment of blazing illumination, something impossible happened. The mountain responded. Deep beneath the surface, ancient forces stirred. Magma chambers that had been building pressure for decades suddenly found new outlets. The fresh surge of lava that threatened Koda's bridge was diverted into a new channel, one that led away from populated areas and into a deep ravine where it could flow harmlessly to the sea. But the effort required to redirect such massive geological forces was immense, and Willow, the small child who had somehow become the conduit for this miracle, was paying the price. Her golden glow began to flicker and fade. Her small body, which had been rigid with concentration, started to sway weakly. Blood began to trickle from her nose as the strain of channeling such power took its toll. "Willow!" Grace reached for her daughter, catching the child just as she began to collapse. But Willow's work wasn't finished yet. With the last of her strength, she managed to whisper one final message to the bear cub who had trusted her with his life. "Run, baby bear, run to your mama." And Koda, understanding in the way that only animals can, sprinted across the remaining section of the crumbling bridge and leaped into his mother's waiting arms. As soon as the cub was safe, Willow's eyes rolled back and she went completely limp in her mother's arms. The mysterious sound that had filled the air for the past hour suddenly stopped, leaving an eerie silence that was broken only by the distant rumble of lava flows now heading safely away from populated areas. "Is she?" David couldn't finish the question. Mrs. Clearwater placed a gentle hand on Willow's forehead, checking for signs of life. After what felt like an eternity, she smiled. "She's alive, but she's going to need time to recover. What she just did, it's not something the human body is designed to handle. She's essentially been a lightning rod for the Earth's own energy." Ranger Santos was finally able to get through on her radio, and the reports she received were nothing short of miraculous. The lava flows had indeed changed direction, diverting away from Pine Creek and Cascade Ridge. Emergency crews were reporting that while significant forest area had been lost, not a single human life was in danger. And most importantly, wildlife observers were confirming that a mother bear and her cub had been spotted moving safely away from the volcanic zone, heading toward the sanctuary of the lower forests. As they carefully transported Willow back down the mountain, Grace held her unconscious daughter close and marveled at what they had witnessed. Her little girl had somehow communicated with a wild animal, convinced a volcano to change its course and saved hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. But even more remarkable was what Willow had taught them about the interconnectedness of all living things, about how sometimes the most innocent among us could see truths that escaped adults entirely, about how love and compassion could transcend species, distance, and even the laws of physics themselves. When Willow finally woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed, the first thing she asked was, "Is Baby Bear safe?" When Grace assured her that yes, the bear cub was safe and sound with his mother, Willow smiled the most beautiful smile her parents had ever seen. "Good," she said simply. "I knew we could help if we just listened to what the mountain was trying to tell us." And somehow, that 3-year-old's explanation made more sense than anything any scientist or expert had been able to offer about the events of that extraordinary night. But the story was far from over. The connection that Willow had forged with the mountain, with the bear cub, and with the very essence of nature itself would continue to grow and develop in ways that no one could have predicted. What had begun as a simple family evacuation had become something much greater, a revelation about the hidden connections that bind all life together, and a reminder that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important messages. The bond between a human child and a bear cub had somehow saved them all, and in the years to come, That bond would continue to work miracles in ways that defied all explanation, but demanded to be believed. As spring returned to the mountain 6 months later, the Chen family made their first trip back to what had once been their home. The volcano had finally settled into dormancy, leaving behind a transformed landscape of hardened lava fields and new growth pushing through the volcanic soil. Willow, now walking more confidently but still small for her age, insisted on visiting the observation platform where she had performed her miracle. She moved with purpose, holding her father's hand, but leading the way with an assurance that amazed her parents. When they reached the platform, they found they weren't alone. Mrs. Clearwater was there, standing quietly with a young park ranger who introduced himself as Ranger Martinez. But it was the third visitor who took their breath away. A magnificent mother bear sat calmly about 30 feet away, and beside her was a young cub who had grown considerably since that terrifying night 6 months ago. Coda was now almost twice his original size, his fur thick and glossy, his movements confident and playful. "They come here every few weeks," Mrs. Clearwater said softly. "Just sits there peacefully for an hour or so, then moves on. Never caused any trouble for the tourists." As if sensing their arrival, Sage lifted her massive head and looked directly at the little family. Her dark eyes met Willow's, and for a moment the same golden light that had surrounded the child during her connection with the mountain flickered briefly in both their gazes. Coda raised his head too, his small ears perking up as he caught sight of Willow. For a heartbeat, bear cub and human child simply looked at each other across the distance that separated them. Then, to everyone's amazement, Coda stood up on his hind legs and made a soft, melodic sound that was part chirp, part purr. Willow laughed with delight and waved her small hand. "Hi, baby bear, you got so big." As if understanding her words, Coda dropped back to all fours and playfully bounded in a small circle, showing off his size and strength to his human friend. Sage watched this interaction with what could only be described as approval, her massive frame relaxed and peaceful. "The connection is still there," Mrs. Clearwater observed with wonder. "Even now, even at this distance, they recognize each other." David felt tears in his eyes as he watched his daughter wave enthusiastically at the bear cub she had saved. Grace wrapped her arms around her husband and daughter, creating a family embrace as they witnessed this impossible reunion. "Will they always be connected like this?" Grace asked quietly. Mrs. Clearwater smiled. "Some bonds transcend the physical world. What your daughter did that night created a thread between her soul and that cub's that can never be broken. They may not see each other often, but they'll always know the other is safe." As they prepared to leave, Sage rose to her powerful legs and began walking away, her cub trotting alongside her. But before disappearing into the forest, Coda stopped and looked back one more time. He made that same melodic sound, softer now, like a goodbye song. Willow blew him a kiss and whispered, "Stay safe, baby bear. I'll always be listening if you need me." Then the bears vanished into the green depths of the recovering forest, leaving the humans with hearts full of wonder and gratitude. As they drove away from the mountain that day, Willow fell asleep in her car seat with a peaceful smile on her face. In her dreams, she could feel the contentment of a young bear playing safely with his mother in a sunlit meadow. She could sense the mountain itself, strong and stable once again, its ancient fires resting peacefully beneath layers of new earth. And far away, in that sunlit meadow, a bear cub named Coda paused in his play to look toward the distant human settlement. He couldn't understand the feeling that warmed his heart whenever he thought of the little human who had saved his life, but he knew that somewhere out there, someone cared about him with the same fierce love his mother showed him every day. The volcano was quiet now, its fury spent, its lessons learned. The scorched earth was already showing signs of new life as nature began its patient work of healing. And in the space between worlds, where the impossible becomes possible and love transcends all boundaries, the bond between a human child and a bear cub continued to pulse with the quiet strength of a miracle. Some stories end with dramatic conclusions and tied-up loose ends. But this story ends with a simple truth, that in a world full of division and fear, sometimes the purest connections come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes a 3-year-old child and a baby bear can teach us more about compassion, courage, and unity than all the wisdom of adults combined. And sometimes, if we listen carefully to the whispers of the wind and the songs of the earth itself, we might just hear the echoes of their friendship, reminding us that all living things are connected by invisible threads of love that can never be broken. The mountain sleeps peacefully now, guarding its secrets and watching over all the creatures who call it home. And somewhere in its ancient memory it holds the story of the night a little girl taught the world that miracles are real, that love knows no boundaries, and that the smallest acts of courage can move mountains themselves. This is where our story truly begins and never ends, in the eternal dance between human hearts and wild souls, forever connected across the beautiful mystery of life itself.